In this video, I'm going to talk about different types of memory, the ways that we measure them, and give you some good examples of those. So let's talk about the types of memory. 3 types of memory: sensory, short-term, and long-term. And they proceed in that order. Sensory is very brief, less than a second. Information needs to get to our brain through our senses, usually our eyes and ears, but our other senses work as well. I'm not going to focus too much on that. Short-term memory is the next kind, sometimes called working memory. Short-term memory is what you're working on or focusing on at the moment, your conscious attention. And your attention wanders, so this is constantly changing. New things are pushing out what's there so that you can focus on the next thing that's happening, rather than what I said 5 or 10 minutes ago. So there's a limit of how many things we can keep in short-term memory, because it's like a leaky bucket. Liquid's constantly coming in and it's constantly leaking out, and that's how it works. It's supposed to be that way. You can keep things in here by a practice technique we call practice in memory rehearsal, by repeating it over and over again. So that phone number you're trying to remember until you can get to your phone and punch it in, or dial the phone in which it's stored, is just repeating it over and over again. Okay, 503 642 blah blah blah. You repeat it, and that works temporarily. It keeps things in your short-term memory until you use it, and then you usually forget it. It doesn't do well for keeping things for much longer time periods or more permanently, but it's good for short-term memory in general. That's called maintenance rehearsal. Some things about short-term memory is there is a limit of how much we can store in there, but the limit is not a set number. You'll read up and hear about 7 plus or minus 2, which is about 5 to 9 things, units, chunks, we like to call them. So it's not necessarily names or numbers. Let me give you some examples. I'm going to read you a word list. So try this out. Get out a piece of paper. See if you can remember these things. Don't write them down as I'm saying them to you. Wait until I tell you to take the test. Just try to remember from hearing these. I'm going to read you a list of words, and this should be fairly difficult. So you don't expect perfection. Just do the best you can. So here's the words. I'll tell you when I finish, and then you write them down as quickly as you can. Okay, here we go. With, fish, went, can, a, old, to, by, the, gray, the, ugly, of, hair, store, man, to, tuna. Okay, write down as many of those as you can remember right now, and you can stop the video for a second. So now that you've stopped the video, you should have stopped. I'm going to read that list again, the same words, but now I'm organizing them differently, and I guarantee that your performance will be better. Most of you will get a perfect score. You will get all 18 words in the correct order. You won't add any words, and you won't leave anything out. So here's the new list. The old ugly man with gray hair went to the store to buy a can of tuna fish. Okay, still 18 words, but really we've chunked it, we've grouped it into 2 or 3 things. If you want to, for those of you English majors, it's a subject phrase and a verb phrase. The old ugly man with gray hair is one phrase, one thing for us to remember. We can sort of store a picture of that in our head. And then the verb phrase, which starts with the verb, went to the store to buy a can of tuna fish. A lot of prepositional phrases in that one long sentence. So the first version, because it's disorganized in random order, we can't group these things together. It overwhelms our short-term memory. It's 18 different things, and that's way beyond the capacity for most people's short-term memory. Whereas in the second example, it's the same words in a different order became 2 or 3 things, well within the capability and capacity of our short-term memory. Another way that we tend to chunk things together into groups, it's consolidating them so that they're one thing or 2 things instead of 4 or 5 things, is by the acronyms, using the first letter as a start to an abbreviation, and we remember the abbreviated initials because they make a word or something memorable. So you only have to remember that one thing. So for example, if you're not feeling well or you have a young child that's not feeling well, I first heard this at the pediatrician's office, there's the BRAT diet, BRAT, kids, okay? So B-R-A-T, bananas, rice, applesauce, toast. Easy on the stomach, easy when you're not feeling well or you've had some nausea and you're a little bit out of time. Okay. Also, rice, R-I-C-E. Now, rice, it literally isn't something we use for injuries, but here's something to use for later on. Imagine somebody at a wedding with a broken leg. The bride has a broken leg, but everybody's happy. They're throwing rice at her. Rice injuries. That's something I'm going to talk about in a little bit. That's called elaborative rehearsal that I just did. I just made that up right now. How do you like that? Okay, so rice, injuries, rest, ice, compression, elevation. A standard of 4 basic things that we often do to help immediately when someone has some sort of injury. You twist an ankle, something like that. Okay, long-term memory, another type of memory, the third type of memory. This is one of the amazing things. Very different process. So don't think of short and long in short-term and long-term memory as the difference between what you think is a short amount of time and a long amount of time. 5 minutes versus 50 minutes or versus 5 days, 5 years. 5 days isn't short-term memory and 5 years long-term memory. They're both probably long-term memory if you remember it. Because they're not what you're working on at the moment. Long-term memory is an unlimited amount of space we have to store all sorts of things. The things that have happened to us, the events in our lives, which we call episodic long-term memory. There's procedural long-term memory, which is how to physically do something. It's our physical memory. Sometimes athletes call this muscle memory, physical skill. Your semantic memory, your memory for facts and understanding data, how things work, meanings, things like that. So let's take riding a bike, for example. Riding a bike, physically, the memory of how to do this is your procedural memory. Sometimes this is called non-declarative or implicit. It's implied by doing it, not by saying it. Non-declarative, we don't say it, we show it. So procedural memory, our memory of physically how to do a task. So if you haven't ridden a bike for many years, but you suddenly got on one, probably wouldn't take you long to figure it out again and to show that you actually physically remember how to do it. Your nervous system can do it. What about episodic related to riding a bike? Episodic memory of riding a bike would be a specific incident that occurred when you rode a bike. So let's say the first time you learned, maybe one of your parents was holding the bike at the back, you're riding down the street and then they let go as they were walking slightly behind you and you didn't realize they had let go and lo and behold, you're riding a bike. That's an episodic memory of riding a bike, not a physical memory. So it's episodic. And semantic. Okay, semantic memory of riding, of a bike riding or something related to bike. This would be, what are the benefits of riding a bike? Understanding that it is a mode of, an example of transportation. The ideas, understanding that that's called semantic memory. So we have these 3 different types, at least, of long-term memory, and all this information that we have is stored in various ways and organized, and sometimes it's hard to access. You have to go about it a certain kind of way. So that's long-term memory. Semantic and episodic are considered explicit or declarative because we can speak, we can communicate verbally and express that memory in that way, whereas the physical is the procedural, so that's implicit. Okay. We talked about maintenance rehearsal as a way to keep things in short-term memory. As long as you keep repeating something, it stays there and then it's gone, often. Elaborative rehearsal means we elaborate. We do something more with it. We make some kind of memory system, often associating things together. Visual imagery really helps. Things that just seem to go together in our mind and we make them connected. That makes it more meaningful. That's elaborative rehearsal. Here's an example. A few years ago, I forgot a student's name that I thought I should have remembered. She had taken one of my classes previously, and it was a PE class, and I felt bad myself. She didn't realize because I was just sort of saying it in my head, and I remembered the other student's name. So I made a special effort to remember her name. I'm not going to tell you what her name was, but her first name was the same name as the dog next door that I already knew. And so what I did to associate these things together in elaborative rehearsal, I made up an image or a story. This image in my mind was this girl walking that dog next door. Dog was a Labradoodle next door. So she's walking a Labradoodle holding a leash. I'm picturing this in my mind. And because the name's the same, there's no way I'm going to forget that. So that's very memorable for a long time. So long-term memory with elaborative rehearsal can do quite some amazing things. And as we get older, we just put more and more things in there into our long-term memory. You would think there we reach a point where you can't put anything more in there. Sometimes things don't get accessible very well, especially if we don't use them or they're not stored in an organized way. But it's amazing how much. Long-term memory is like a library with complex floors and stacks of books and information, and it's expandable. So over the years, as we put more and more things in there, the library gets bigger. That's the metaphor I could use. Whereas I said the leaky bucket for short-term memory, or short-term memory could be a box. Once you put too many things in there, if you want to put more things in there, pay attention to the next thing. You're going to have to remove something so it goes out of there. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about measuring memory. There are two major ways. There's a third I'm not going to talk about now, but they're called recall and recognition. Recall, it tends to be more difficult. It's when we are asked a question or we are trying to remember something and we have a very limited amount of cues, signals to help us, clues, you might think of them. Recognition is simply recognizing and identifying the information. Imagine when you're taking tests at school. Recognition is like multiple choice tests or perhaps true-false tests as well, where the answer's right there, you just have to pick it out. Recall is like an essay test. What's the difference between classical and operant conditioning? Discuss this in a paragraph. Who was Pavlov? What's the definition of psychology? These are all recall questions. You're really given a question, but no other clues whatsoever. Whereas with recognition, you can just pick it out. And in fact, you can guess and be correct, maybe not even knowing the right answer. A drawback of multiple choice exams, but they have their pluses as well. So let's play a little game and try this out. No points off for getting anything wrong, but just try it for fun. I call this Trump Trivia. So the first version is going to be recall. It will probably be harder, but I want you to keep your score. So play along with me. You can write down your answers to these things. I'm not going to give you a long time, but anyways. So question 1, name 2 of Donald Trump's 5 children, just the first names, 2 of his 5 kids. So come up with that. If you need to press pause on the video, that's fine because I'm going to keep going, give you a few extra seconds. Don't give yourself too long on that one, maybe no more than 10 to 15 seconds on each question. Question 2, name 1 of his ex-wives. He has had at least 2 ex-wives. So 1 of his ex-wives, their first name. Pause if you need to. Question 3. What was Donald Trump's major in college? Okay, again, no clue. That's a recall question. I'm not giving you any options. There are quite a few options, so you pick out what you think it is. And guessing's okay. But again, we're going to compare our scores. Question 4. In what state was he born? In what U.S. state was Donald Trump born? Question 5. What's his age? A whole number, so no fractions and all that. What's his age right now? Question 6, what is his height? And question 7, what's his weight? Now, let's go back over this. I'm going to give you the same 7 questions, and this is going to be a recognition task. So I'll tell you the answers at the end. Hopefully you'll get a better score, or a good score either way, but you'll probably get a better score on the recognition task, even if you thought, I don't know any of this stuff. This means it's multiple choice. You pick out the right answer. And as I said, true, false, and sometimes matching can be also considered recognition memory tasks. So Question 1. Name 2 of his 5 children. Here are your choices. Alice, Baron, Donald, Roberta. Alice, Baron, Donald, Roberta. 2 of those are correct answers. So you pick out which one you want to pick. We'll get the answers later. Question 2. Name 1 of his ex-wives. Your choices are Cindy, Marla, or Sarah. Cindy, Marla, Sarah. Question 3. His college major. Economics, history, computer science. College major. Question 4. What U.S. state was he born? California, Florida, New York. Question 5. His age. I'm going to give you a number. 66, 74, 78. What's his age today? 66, 74, or 78? You pick it out. Question 6. What's his height? Here are your choices. 5'7", 6 feet, 6'3". And last question, his weight. At least the last time I researched it. 200, 240, 280. Now let's go over the answers and you compare your scores. And if you didn't fit the expectation of getting the recognition questions, if you got 0 on both, then fine. I probably would have as well. But let's see, my hypothesis, my prediction would be that you would get more questions correctly on the recognition method. And in fact, if we were considering this a psychological laboratory experiment, if you remember the experimental method from a few chapters ago, the recall recognition, those would be the 2, that would be the independent variable. Which method we used? We used, instead of having 2 different groups, we have the same group of people, but trying 2 different methods, which is another way to do the experimental method. So let's get back to the task here. Okay, question 1. 2 of his 5 children, correct answers are Baron and Donald. Baron and Donald. FYI, he does have other children. I just didn't include them in the multiple choice. They're Eric, Ivanka, and Tiffany. Question 2, 1 of his ex-wives. In your choices, Cindy, Marla, Sarah. Marla is the correct answer. Ivana is another answer, but that wasn't one of the choices, so you could get credit for Ivana in the recall part of this task, but not in the recognition. And the previous question, if you named one of the children that was not given in multiple choice, but it was correct during the recall, you could get that. If you're not following me, don't worry, or rewind it, whatever. College major, economics. College major was economics. 4, in what U.S. state was he born? New York. 5, his age right now is 74. He was born in June 1946. Height, 6'3", and weight, 240. So that's facts, Trump trivia for today. Answer any questions that are on your homework assignment. See you next time.